The new Genesys format has soft banned many cards by giving them a huge 100-point cost, meaning that if you play them, you can't play any other pointed cards. So every card at 100 points is essentially banned as a result, as not playing any other pointed cards is far too high of a cost to justify playing one of those cards. However, not every card at 100 points is actually all that great, and many 100-point cards are actually quite weak. And starting things off at number 10, we have number 59, Crooked Cook. This is a rank 4 Fire Warrior with 2300 attack and 200 defense, with the effects where, as long as you control no other cards, this card is unaffected by your opponent's card effects. Also, once per turn as a quick effect, you can detach an Xyz material from Cook to destroy as many cards you control as possible, besides Cook, and then it gains 300 attack until the end of the turn for each monster destroyed and sent to the graveyard by the effect. Crooked Cook is a card that's extremely frustrating to deal with, as are most Towers monsters. Almost all forms of interaction can't get rid of the Cook, and you can't even negate its effects to turn on your removal. There is one easy way to get rid of the Cook, and that's by destroying it by battle. Any monster with at least 2300 attack can destroy Cook during the damage step. Normally, you could get around this by giving it a Moon Mirror Shield or some other form of battle protection, but that's not possible here thanks to Cook's restriction. Or at least, it isn't with the typical cards. Instead, you can use a card like Right Hand Shark, which gives any Xyz monster it's attached to as a material and effect where it can't be destroyed by battle, meaning that it's almost impossible to get rid of now. You can still kaiju it, as that's realistically the most common way to get around this board. However, with all of that said, Crooked Cook isn't all that strong in the grand scheme of things. Cook doesn't exactly put a ton of pressure on your opponent, and it's difficult to mount any offense with it in your board thanks to its downside. So at most, it just stalls for a few turns while you try to draw your way into a better board, but only if you manage to actually make it indestructible by battle. This, along with many other cards on this list, were banned simply for being annoying, more so than their power level. Crooked Cook is a card that any deck could play to try to get a few extra draws if they could make rank 4s. Even if it's not great, it sure is a pain to lose games too, and if it weren't pointed, it may become annoyingly common. So Konami simply decided to take it out before it could become a nuisance in the game. And at number 9, we have And the Band Played On. This is a continuous trap with the effect where neither player can special summon any monsters with the same level as any other monster they control, and they can't summon any monsters with the same rank as any monsters they control. This is another continuous floodgate in the vein of cards like There Can Be Only One, Goes in Match, and Rivalry of Warlords. Except unlike those cards, which interfere with almost every deck in the game, And the Band Played On is quite narrow. It's kind of a coin flip whether or not a deck focuses on summoning monsters of the same level or not. For every deck that gets completely shut down by this card, there's another one that doesn't. This is why And the Band Played On hasn't seen that much play in Constructed. There's just better ways to try to lock your opponent out of the game, such as any of the other floodgates I mentioned before. However, Genesys as a format is very notably anti-floodgate, with the sole exception of Macrocosmos for some reason. Basically, every good floodgate is at 100 points already, so if this card wasn't pointed heavily, it would become the new best floodgate for people to play. Sure, a lot of decks don't care about it, but a lot of decks isn't all decks. There are games where you flip And the Band Played On going first and win because of it. Even worse, the card is actually buffed in Genesys format, as there's no longer options like Nightmare Phoenix to answer it easily. Links are the only type of monster that And the Band Played On doesn't affect, so having spell and trap removal on a Link monster would have allowed a lot of decks to easily destroy the card. However, without that option being available, there aren't easy ways for most decks that would be shut down for this trap to get around it. In summary, And the Band Played On is simply a frustrating card that would have been more frustrating in this format specifically were it not to be pointed so aggressively. And at number 8, we have Level Eater. This is a level 1 Dark Insect with 600 attack and 0 defense. It has the effect where, while this card is in your graveyard, you can target one level 5 or higher monster you control, reduce its level by 1, and then special summon this card. Also, this face-up card can't be tributed for anything besides a tribute summon. Level Eater is a really interesting card, because it's one of several cards that was mostly fine before Link monsters were introduced to the game. While Link monsters notably don't have levels, it's not hard to summon a single high-level monster and use it to summon Level Eater. Use Eater to summon a Link monster with it, Then resummon Level Eater and use it to make the first Link monster a new Link monster. Rinse and repeat until you have a board full of Link boss monsters. While there have always been decks that could make far too many Link monsters, Level Eater gives this Link spamming ability to basically every deck in Yu-Gi-Oh!, which would make things a bit silly. However, since Link monsters as a rule are banned in Genesys format, this use case of Level Eater has no impact on the format at all. So what exactly are they so scared of? Well, before the advent of Links, Level Eater mostly found its home in synchro combo decks. Level Eater is very useful in these decks for allowing you to manipulate the levels of monsters on your field to make synchro plays more easily. For example, let's say you wanted to summon a Coral Dragon or an XL Synchron, but you only have a level 6 or 5 monster alongside your Jet Synchron. Level Eater can allow you to lower the level of that monster to perform the synchro summon, and then you can use Level Eater as a material for a synchro summon later on, still getting value out of the level that the Eater took. This is very useful for these decks, but it's not necessarily broken. It's a bit strange that they hit this card so harshly while other cards like Pot of Greed are only at 30 points. However, it is a card you only really need one copy of to get the full value thanks to cards like Where Art Thou, which can search out Level Eater easily. And there may have been new interactions that have been printed into the game since Level Eater's banning that don't involve links that they're worried about. It's a bit of a strange ban, but it's not as if it's completely out of left field. And at number 7, we have Brain Research Lab and a Telekinetic Charging Cell. Starting with the Research Lab, this is a field spell with the effect where, once per turn, you can normal summon one additional Psychic type monster in addition to your normal summoner set. But when you do, you put a counter on this card. Whenever you would pay life points to activate the effect of a Psychic type monster you control, you can skip paying the life points and instead put a counter on this card. But if this card is ever removed from the field, you take 1000 damage for each counter on the lab. The Charging Cell, on the other hand, is an equip spell that equips only to a Psychic type monster, and allows you to activate that monster's effect without paying any life points. Also, when this equipped monster is destroyed, you can pay 1000 life points to return this card to your hand. These are two cards that only ever do unfair things. One of the sillier applications of them is combining them with Cyberstein alongside Rebodocus to turn it into a Psychic type monster, so that you can use it to cheat out any number of fusion monsters from your extra deck, which is powerful, but not feasible in this format without links available. The main and original culprit for this card's reputation is Mind Master. This is a level 1 Psychic monster with the effect where you can pay 800 life points and tribute another Psychic type monster in order to special summon another level 4 lower Psychic type monster from your deck. This was originally used to do stupid OTKs, but there are a lot of very dumb things you can do with it nowadays. For example, there's the card Cam Serenity of Gusto. This is a level 4 Psychic with the effect where, on a soft once per turn, you can shuffle 2 Gusto monsters from your graveyard into your deck to draw 1 card. With Mind Master, you can cycle through a few copies of another Gusto Psychic monster and then grab a Cam, draw a card with its effect, then cycle for another Cam and shuffle the original back into your deck, draw again. And you can do this indefinitely to draw your entire deck. With all of this card draw, you can easily draw all pieces of Exodia and win the game on your first turn, or do any other number of silly FTKs. You can tell this is exactly what they wanted to box out, as Mind Master cost exactly 1 point to prevent you from playing either of these cards and Mind Master in the same deck together. While all of this is potentially powerful, it's not exactly consistent or good. Any hand trap stops this deck in its tracks, obviously. But it's also quite clear that they don't want Genesys to be a format where hand traps are absolutely mandatory. As a result, any and all FTKs have been kinda banned from the format, even ones that aren't particularly good. So while these cards aren't actually that big of a threat, Konami decided that Genesys was better off without them, which is probably for the best. And at number 6, we have Dragon Master Magia. This is a light dragon fusion monster with 5000 attack and 4000 defense. It requires the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, or 3 copies of Blue Eyes White Dragon, and a Chaos or Blackluster Soldier ritual monster as its fusion materials. It has the effect where it must be fusion summoned, and when your opponent activates a card or effect, you can negate the activation and destroy that card. And you can only do this once for each card type per turn, the card types being monster, spell, and trap. If this card leaves the field because of an opponent's card effect, you can special summon a Blue Eyes monster, Chaos, or Blackluster Soldier ritual monster from a graveyard or extra deck. Dragon Master Magia is an extremely powerful monster, if you can actually summon it. The problem is that actually performing the fusion summon is quite difficult. You have to either first special summon Ultimate Dragon, which requires 3 copies of Blue Eyes White Dragon, so you have to find 3 copies of Blue Eyes White Dragon either way. The Chaos and BLS rituals aren't as difficult to find, but these are almost all Dark Magician support, so they work fairly poorly with most Blue Eyes variants. The easiest way to summon the card is to use an effect like Extra Foolish Burial to send Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon to the graveyard, and then fusion summon Magia with Ultimate Fusion, which can fusion summon a card that mentions Blue Eyes White Dragon or a Blue Eyes monster by using materials in your graveyard. This isn't super consistent, but there are some decks that can actually pull this off, the Dogmatica engine being the main culprit. This usually isn't enough to make the deck broken. However, in Genesys format, the lower power level of decks makes Magia a lot more attractive. The lower power level means that decks can afford to be slightly clunkier in some ways, while simultaneously meaning that if you do summon Magia, it's basically game over. Even in advanced format, finding a way to win against Magia is extremely difficult, with its multiple negates. In Genesys, where decks have less consistency, less hand traps, and less overall board breakers, it's a huge problem. Magia is another card that, even if it wasn't completely optimal, would create a very unfair experience in a lot of games where it's cheap to play in the format. As a result, the card was soft banned before seeing the light of day. And at number 5, we have Angel 07. This is a level 7 light fairy with 2500 attack and 1500 defense. It has the effect where, if this monster is tribute summoned, it gains the effect where no monsters can activate their effects. This is yet another floodgate, which, as we've said, Genesys is very against. If Angel 07 is successfully summoned, almost every deck in the game will be without any meaningful play, unless you happen to draw a card like Primite Drillbeam that can quickly and easily deal the Angel. Both players will be forced to play a long, boring game where Angel slowly beats down whatever random monster you're setting face down to try to keep yourself alive. Combine this with forms of interaction that Angel doesn't stop, such as Solemn Judgment, and actually doing anything to an opponent who summons Angel 07 on turn 1 is essentially impossible. However, this is a big if. If your opponent does tribute Angel 07 on turn 1, this is how the game will likely go. The problem is actually pulling that off. Tribute summoning a 2 tribute monster is mildly difficult in general, but doing it even somewhat consistently on turn 1 is a pipe dream. Worse, if you can actually find a way to consistently tribute summon Angel 07 on turn 1, it almost certainly is going to force you to build a deck that Angel 07 also turns off. You could use a small engine of Speedroy Terratop and Speedroy Takatomborg to get the tribute material you need, but that means your deck is going to be full of monsters whose effects Angel 07 is just going to be turning off. And no, there's not really a great way to get 2 monsters worth of tribute materials on a board easily without playing monster cards or locking yourself. The card has never seen any serious play in advanced format, to the point that most players probably didn't even know what this card was before this format was announced. Really, the soft banning of Angel 07 mostly serves to show how aggressive Konami is towards floodgates in this format. And at number 4, we have Royal Magical Library. This is a level 4 light spellcaster with 0 attack and 2000 defense. It has the effect where, when a spell card is activated, you put a spell counter on this card during the spell's resolution, with a maximum of 3 at once. When this card has 3 spell counters on it, you can remove all of them to draw 1 card. Royal Magical Library's only real use is in deep draw FTK decks. The goal is to summon Royal Magical Library, then activate a ton of cards like Into the Void, Upstart Goblin, and Chicken Game to cycle through your deck until you find a win condition, which is often Exodia. There are a few layers here. For one, this strategy has never really been viable, even in the earliest days of the game when hand traps weren't quite as popular. It's only gotten worse over the years as most players are main decking more and more of this type of interaction. Considering how long the deck hasn't been viable, it may be a surprise to see this card so harshly limited. However, it becomes even more strange considering that all the spells you would play alongside the library are already hit. Into the Void costs 3 points, Chicken Game costs 7 points, Allure of Darkness costs 5, and so on and so on. The only notable cycling spell that doesn't cost points is Upstart Goblin, and this has a bigger impact than you may think. The entire point of this deck is to have a high enough density of cycling spells so that your deck can do the same thing every game, meaning you'll probably be maxing out on these cards, and they add up fast. Even putting library something like 50 points would have made fitting in a single copy of the card into a deck with all the cycling spells very difficult, and that would be your entire point budget just for the draw engine. Overall, it just wouldn't be worth it. You may wonder why they decided to point the card so aggressively anyway, and if we must speculate, the reason is likely that this is kind of all Royal Magical Library does. It doesn't have any other applications. And since its only application it has is being in FTKs, it seems that Konami decided the format was just better off without the card at all. And at number 3, we have Life Equalizer. This is a normal trap with the effect where, if the difference between both players' life totals is at least 8,000, you can make both players' life totals become 3,000. The goal with Life Equalizer is pretty obvious. By forcing your opponent to go all the way down to only 3,000 life points, you can easily steal the game from them with a burn effect. Some of the easiest ways to pull this off is to use cards like Ceasefire, which will burn your opponent for 500 times the number of effect monsters on the field, which isn't hard to do lethal if you combo it with a couple of other burn effects. Of course, this isn't enough to win a game, as you first have to meet Equalizer's activation condition. While creating a life point deficit of 8,000 may seem difficult, it's actually quite simple to accomplish. Cards like Wall of Revealing Light can allow you to pay an arbitrary amount of life points in multiples of 1,000, putting you all the way down to 1,000 life points if need be. Combine this with a single activation of a card like Upstart Goblin or Gift Card in a pinch, and you can be ready to equalize the life totals during your opponent's draw phase. And once you do so, it's quite easy to pull off your pseudo FTK, often before your opponent can mount any sort of comeback. Now, this is very annoying, but it's also kind of terrible. Each of the individual cards involved in this combo is unsearchable and generally bad outside of the context of performing exactly this FTK, and trying to find a way around that only makes the combo more susceptible to hand traps. This is another card that only really serves to make the game worse though. It does nothing besides its FTK, and so Konami decided the format would just be better off without it. And it's difficult to say that they were wrong. And at number 2, we have Final Countdown. This is a normal spell card that has the effect where you pay 2,000 life points and then, after 20 turns have passed, you win the duel. Final Countdown is, in some sense, the best alternate win condition card in Yu-Gi-Oh! This may sound strange, after all, stalling for a few turns is also what it takes to win with Destiny Board, and that card is terrible. The difference here is simple. Final Countdown is basically impossible to interact with, and it's very, very low investment. By simply activating the card, you put the game on a clock that forces your opponent to win the game quickly. And this wouldn't matter in most games thanks to how fast the game is. However, there are ways to stop your opponent from playing at all. Combining Countdown with our good old friend There Can Be Only One, Goes in Match, and Rivalry of Warlords, and you can make it impossible for your opponent to do anything. The flip side of this is that it also usually makes it impossible for you to do anything as well. Stun decks have long since relied on various spell and trap cards to slowly win the game for them after stunning your opponent. And while cards like Cauldron of the Old Man can do this, they're weak to spell and trap card removal. This means that your opponent can interact with the card. And where's the fun in letting your opponent interact with you? Stun players have instead decided to use Final Countdown in many circumstances simply because once it's activated, your opponent can't do anything about it. It also has the upsides of not taking up a spell and trap card zone, so you can set more floodgates or counter traps to mess with your opponent. Here's the thing, Stun has rarely been the best archetype in Yu-Gi-Oh! Even when Mystic Mine was running around, it was most infuriating in decks like Sky Striker that could use it to floodgate your opponent if their normal game plan didn't work out. And in fact, Stun players found out over time that it's actually more efficient to not play a win condition and to just stall until your opponent runs out of cards in their deck before you do. Not only does this mean that Countdown hasn't actually been that successful in tournaments, all those floodgates are also at 100 points in Genesys. They could have put this card at 1 point and still couldn't activate it and then flip a floodgate to lock out your opponent. It may have been a bit overkill, but at the same time, no one is going to be sad to see Final Countdown taken out of the game. And at number 1, we have Self-Destruct Button. This is a trap card with the effect where, if you have less life points than your opponent, and the difference in your life points total is at least 7,000, then both players' life points become 0. This essentially forces the game to a draw, and no, there is no way to circumvent this. Self-Destruct Button is a strange card for so many reasons. For one, it is maybe the only card in the game that can never win you a game of Yu-Gi-Oh! It can only ever make the game a draw, so it may seem like the card has no competitive purpose. However, that's not quite true, as while it can't win you any games of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Self-Destruct Button could potentially win you matches. If you're in a situation where there's no way for you to win, staring down a huge board of imposing monsters, you can use Self-Destruct Button to restart the game and essentially get another try. Of course, you do need to set up your life total beforehand properly, but that's not hard to pull off in the right deck. And you can always just use our old friend Wall of Revealing Light if you really need to. This is extremely annoying, but it's not exactly good. Why spend all of these cards and resources getting another shot at the game when you could actually just try to win? While it is true that this isn't the most optimal way to build your deck, that doesn't mean it isn't a huge problem. Self-Destruct Button presents a lot of logistical issues for tournament organizers, thanks to how long it can prolong matches, not to mention how it would interact with the newer end-of-match procedures that preclude draws from ever being entered to the score. This is maybe the most annoying card for tournament organizers. So it's probably not surprising that the card was banned in the TCG simply to help tournaments run better. And that philosophy seems to have translated to Genesys format as well. We've talked a lot about cards that are soft banned in Genesys, not for being too powerful, but for the game simply being better off without them. Self-Destruct Button is maybe the best example of a card that's not good, but one that you still do not want to play against. So it easily takes the top spot on this list.